Got so many things you got to do to get prepared, right? You will note the sermon title. Oh, you're just going to be a distraction through this whole thing, aren't you? I know. Well, sermon title is Resurrecting a Lynched Jesus. For those of you who are here today, it is important that you know that for our Lenten study, we did James Cone, the cross and the lynching tree, as part of our racial justice journey. We are moving toward becoming a church that identifies as a racial justice church. So that was our study. It was not easy, and nor was it joyful, but it was necessary. And so when we look at what Cone was trying to do throughout this book, we recognize that Jesus was indeed lynched. And all of those who have been lynched were crucified. That there is no way to differentiate the two. Both were designed to assure the annihilation of the person, but even more so to strike terror into those who would witness the death by lynching or by crucifixion. That's pretty profound. And it's something that I think that a lot of us weren't aware of, but we certainly are now and will continue to be as we go forward. Now, I want to say a little bit about this particular reading. Mallory and I were talking about which version of the resurrection we should use. So we're going to do a little Bible study just for fun, right? Whether you want to or not, you're here now. You're a captive audience. So I plan to use that to my advantage. So when you look at the different versions of the resurrection, knowing that they were written during different places and different times, it's important to understand some context. So Mark, for example, was written a good 40 years after Jesus' death. Matthew and Luke, probably somewhere between about 80 years. 70 years. And then John kind of jumps in a good 80 years after Jesus. So we're getting different versions depending on what the audience at the time needed to hear and what the person who was telling the story needed them to hear, right? So here's the thing about Mark. You got the brief little version of the original text, as far as we know. But it is followed up by two other versions. So the next version in line is called the shorter version, but actually was written probably 300 years later. And that version notes that Mary Magdalene had a little more to do. Plus, it identifies Mary as having demons driven out of her, which is news to me. But anyway, that's what the author wanted the audience to know at that time. The longer version, which is written probably within 150 years, really focuses on Peter as head of the church. So we don't know what his message was about, do we? Right? But it's important to understand this because we know that how stories are written, delivered, and received will impact how they are then again written, delivered, and received 2,000 years later. Now, I want to be very clear, and some of you have heard me say this. When we are talking about crucifixion being the annihilation of the body, that means something very particular to our theological background. What it means, contextually speaking, literally speaking, if you will, and how crucifixion was used is that that body never came off the cross to be buried. It never came off the cross to be buried because the design was that the person would be annihilated. They were gone, never to be seen or heard of again. Well, if we jump ahead, though, and say, well, maybe in this one case there was an actual burial, then the other piece we have to look at is, okay, but once the stone is rolled in front of the tomb, the body is gone, never to be seen or heard of again. So if we didn't get it the first time, they're going to reiterate. Now, we can get caught up in the literal piece of that, or we can recognize the profundity of the metaphor, which is everything that was set in motion to assure the annihilation of the existence of Jesus didn't work. It didn't work. So if you're hanging on to this different stories and taking different versions and interpretations from a little literal perspective, I think we come to a similar outcome at the end. It didn't work, or we wouldn't be here right now. Okay? So one of the questions we have to ask whenever we're reading scripture, hearing a story, or any story that's being told, including the cross and the lynching tree, is what does it mean? Because we can get caught up in arguments and everything else about, well, I interpret it this way and I interpret it that. That's fine, but what is the meaning? Now, here's where things get a little tricky. Because not all meaning is generated from the imagination and the vision that God has for this world, but rather the imagination and the vision that we think God has for this world. Those are profoundly different things, by the way. I don't know if you know that, but I figure I'll just let you know. Right? I know. I have a quick question because I just want to hear from you. For those of you who were able to engage in the book, I want to know, has resurrection, as you have assumed it before, changed? Has your interpretation of what resurrection is, looks like, was supposed to be, can be, will be, whatever, changed since reading The Cross and the Lynching Tree? David, if you could let me know about Zoom, that'd be great. Now, you know that's not a rhetorical question, people. It hasn't changed. So the cross and the lynching tree for Cayenne has not changed your view of resurrection. Okay, you know my next question is. You're in it now, I'm sorry. Have we not met?
One can try.
So what is your view of resurrection that you have held even to now?
It's definitely spiritual. I mean, we live in this world. We have experience. I live in this world. I have experiences, and my experiences of death are not, most of them are not physical in actual fact. My experience of torture and murder to diminish someone or something are great in terms of what I've witnessed, and in some ways what I've personally experienced. And the whole rejection of the physical rising in and of itself, it's more about not letting the mission and the intent die, and continuously bringing it back to life as often as is necessary to make change.
Thank you. I'll let you off the hook. Anybody else want to jump in? Oh, come on. Mara, and then what's your name? Tanya, thank you.
It kind of gave me a sense that when we're talking about resurrection, like that. Okay, so when we're talking about resurrection, I'm maybe starting to view it a little bit less individually, in terms of like the Emmett Till lynching being a cause for the resurrection of a people. Of course, not literally the individual victim returning to life, but the spark for new life in the people themselves.
Wait. No, I'm not done with you yet. Shouldn't have come in. See, it's a little safer up there. Not really. When you're talking about resurrection of a people, what do you mean?
I guess what I mean is like refusing to be denied dignity, refusing to go on the way things have been. They've been intolerable for a long time, but you can tolerate the intolerable potentially indefinitely until you decide we can't, no more.
Especially if you're not on the receiving end of the intolerability.
Oh, yes.
Did I just make up a word, right? Yes. All right, thank you. Okay, you're free.
I always thought of the resurrection of more of an opportunity to start over in this life, but recently I've realized that it has to do also with the allowing of oneself to give up our reins for a greater God, to take over and let Him guide you in this journey.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And you're new, so you're off the hook for now. But if you come back, I'll get you again. So, thank you. Anybody else? When she comes back. Look, see? That's good. Don't mess up my sermon. I'm I'm gonna mess it up too.
So I've read the book before, but not for a little while. And for a long time, I have thought of resurrection as the justice work and joy work and creative work of people building love's domain on the planet, following and modeling Jesus. And what this rereading did for me is it gave me some concrete examples. So now when I think about that justice work and that joy work and the use of music and the use of art and the use of mourning and the use of celebrating and the use of church and the use of singing in bars and all of those things, I just feel like I have a bunch more concrete images in my head of that resurrection happening among these people. And I can pull those examples from the book. Did I mess up your sermon?
Not at all. It was beautiful. It was brilliant. And you didn't even go anywhere near where I'm going.
Hallelujah.
That is really good. Hurry up, because Mallory's chomping at the bit. So if anybody else, Nancy, please.
There was too much good news equals resurrection.
Too much good news equals resurrection?
Yes.
Too much good news. Oh, wow. We could be here forever. Too much good news. All right, we're going to come back. Maybe not today, but we're going to come back. All right, Deborah, I see you.
God keeps putting these opportunities in front of us to live into God's economy here on earth.
God keeps putting opportunities in front of us to live into God's economy on earth.
Yeah. And until the white people in America see the connection of lynching and resurrection and all of that, they won't. We have to see it as our opportunity for resurrection of who we can be in this world.
Huh. Okay, you're getting that much closer to what I was going to say. So I'm
Okay,
going to stop you now. Okay. No, you're right. Deborah, I'm not going to stop you. Keep going. Go ahead. Do you have more?
No, I'm going to stop there because I'm afraid. I'm very afraid.
Oh, you're not afraid. Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you. What else we got? Anybody? Go ahead.
I know you're going to think to me in our conversation.
Yes.
You're hearing me in this too.
Okay. Yes to everything that was offered, and probably yes to pretty much everything that you're all carrying and not saying. During my sabbatical, which I took this last summer, which was based on doing some racial justice work, one of the things that I was writing about was this theology of resurrection. This idea that a lot of us have been raised with, of the notion of, for some reason, Jesus having to suffer and die for all good things to come to fruition. It never made sense to me as a child, having embraced the notion of a loving God. It just didn't make sense that suffering was necessary as opposed to something that happens because we're human beings and we live in the world. But the suffering, the evil, or suffering that is evil, about which we learned Jesus had to go through, didn't make sense to me. And so as I started to think about this notion of suffering as being necessary, it got me very, very angry. If we are viewing Jesus' suffering as necessary, then it's very easy to translate all suffering as necessary and ascribe the blame to God, as it is God's plan that this is happening. You can plug that in to wherever you want. But if we bypass looking at it from that perspective and start to recognize the purpose and meaning and intent of the life of Jesus, then we recognize that his entire life was about dismantling injustices. Everything that was in that song, everything that was in our call to worship, everything that we talk about every single time we come into a group, that his life was about dismantling injustice so that all can flourish. So he is murdered. He is lynched upon a tree after having been tortured and mocked and humiliated, striking fear into those who would be witnesses to this, either witnesses at the time or witnesses today. That suffering was not necessary from the perspective of not something that God demands, nor something that humanity should do. Rather, it was perpetrated upon him because he had the audacity to push back against empire, to demand God's economy, to demand that all people be treated with dignity and respect and have the opportunity for a home, food, clothing, respect, and equity. And it was disruptive. And so he offended the powers that be. He, as one man, could not defeat the Roman Empire. That wasn't the purpose of his execution. He was getting on their nerves, and he was not staying in his place. Every lynching story we read about is about a perception that this person of color for our discussion is not staying in their place and therefore needs to be tortured and suffer and die to send a message. So here's where I flip the theology for myself, and I invite you to do the same. If Jesus's purpose in this world was to call us into relationship with the divine so that we could also dismantle injustices and work toward the equity of all creation, if that was his purpose and that was not fulfilled upon his death that was an execution, I argue there has not yet been a resurrection. It hasn't happened yet. The promise of resurrection exists, and I would suggest that that's what we're here celebrating. But resurrection cannot happen while injustices still exist. It's an impossibility. Because resurrection, as a lot of us have been taught, and as a lot of preachers are teaching this morning, is the end game. It's definitive. It says it's done. It is finished. We don't have anything else we have to do except to drink some Kool-Aid. That is empty. And in my opinion, it negates, diminishes, disrespects the life of Jesus and the life of every other person that has been lynched, enslaved, diminished, continues to be murdered at the hands of state-sanctioned violence, of every people that have to fight for their land because of oil that is more important, for every other people that are not allowed to come in across a false border because their children are dying of starvation. As long as that injustice continues to exist, resurrection cannot happen, period, end of story, but not really the end. Because now we're back to Mark, right? We're back to Mark, who has multiple endings, which just proves to us that we're not finished yet, and that we can still write another ending. I have a story that I want to share. And Mallory, I love what Mallory said, that when someone dies, they really die twice. They die when they stop breathing. They die when we stop saying their name. They die when they stop breathing. They die again. They stop saying their name. And the other thing that she offered to this particular sermon was something even equally as profound, which is we are the ones who maintain the life of the people who die. Because as long as we continue to say their names, they are alive. As is everything they represent, how they lived and how they died. But when we forget our roles as storytellers. His name was James, 16-year-old boy of African descent. His grandmother called him Pookie, his maternal grandmother. Her name was Queen, by the way. And when I met them, I was a young therapist at Hopkins, and I thought she made her name up, not understanding the depth of the history of people from Africa who came from kings and queens and royalty. She was claiming her ancestry, and her mother named her Queen. They were stuck with me, as was typical back in the in inner city Baltimore, as a big outpatient clinic, therapy clinic, only had white therapists. And so any person of color who happened to come in was stuck with us, stuck with me. Whew. We did rounds, Miss Queen and I, when we first got started. And she didn't care what it was going to take to get the point across that I had to help her grandson, because she was going to save his life, because her daughter was already lost. So she'd call me out, and I would learn, and then I'd stumble, and then we'd laugh. And she'd call me out again, and she would laugh with me, she would laugh at me, and then I could laugh too. And I got to work with James for about 1.5 years, and with Queen, and just had honestly, I learned more, but I didn't know I was learning. He was getting ready to graduate high school. She was so proud. He had not succumbed to the pressure of the really violent neighborhood in which they were stuck in. Over Christmas, one of my colleagues was covering for me, my friend Hector, and he called me and he said, I have to tell you that James was killed in a drive-by yesterday. Now, that was not uncommon. What was uncommon is the neighborhood in which he was killed, which was, you have to understand, Baltimore still, but way back then, very distinct neighborhoods. If you were queer, you didn't go into this one or this one. If you were Black, you didn't go into this one or this one. If you're white, well, you did whatever you wanted anyway, but you had opinions about all the others. And James was right over the city line in the county with a friend at a bus stop. Right now, if you're thinking, as I know we all do, well, this was probably what was going on, and this is why he was in that's just another story for another time that we need to touch on, right? We bring our biases as to why he was in a white neighborhood. But he could have been there because that's where the mall was. Could have been there because that's where it was safer and that's where the stores were. We never found out because it was not a case that was pursued. Now, here's the point of me sharing that with you. In the years that I've been doing racial justice work, and that people have said to me, why are you doing this? Where was your transformative experience? What happened that made this a compulsion for you? I forgot about that story. I forgot. A story that's 30 years old, and I forgot about James. And yet, that experience is probably one of the most profound experiences that opened my eyes to what was really going on in the world, whether I integrated it or not. Queen's insistence that I pay attention set me on a course that I forgot about. And so James died again. Until this week, when I got to participate in what resurrection can be, even in the midst of torture and death and devastation. Because now you know James, Pookie, and Queen. You know of somebody who suffered injustice. So in addition to all the other stories that we tell about Amir Locke, about Patrick Loloyi, I hope I said that correctly, we now can add James to the list. And in that way, we hold the sacred story of their memory and we keep them in this state of resurrection in a way that perhaps we didn't understand before. Coming out of this Lenten study where we have learned about the cross and the lynching tree, where we've heard the stories that were in there and they were brutal, we have a choice. We close the book, we put it back on our shelves. Maybe next Lent, we reflect on it and say, boy, I hope we don't have to do something like that again. Or we keep it close and we keep it open. And we who are of a privileged color, which don't get me started, now have the opportunity in keeping the story open to assure that some sort of resurrection happens. So you see, resurrection as it is intended has not yet happened. But the sacredness of the story about resurrection must stay alive. Play with that for a while. Resurrection as it was intended has not yet happened, but resurrection as the story, as the stories must stay alive. We claim to be people of that story. By birthright, by transformation, by conversion, by whatever. We claim to be a people of the cross, of the lynched. So as we celebrate and yet question Easter and resurrection, we must ask ourselves, in what way, I'm doing everything I'm doing, I love it. We must ask ourselves, in what way do we need to live to get us closer to the realization of resurrection? And in what ways will we hold the stories of those who have been forgotten or ignored or made invisible so as to move us closer to that promise of justice for all? And so we say, Alleluia. Amen.